Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the second webinar in our College Counseling 101 series. I'm so glad you can join us today. I know many of our peers aren't able to join us because of what today is all about out in the high school world. So let's talk about what our topic is today. So our topic is to test or not to test, how to advise our students in the test optional college admission or possible test optional college admission process. The irony is, yes, today is National PSAT Day. We have sophomores and juniors, and some of you probably even have freshmen taking it, depending on your state. But so that 19 of you that have joined us, thanks for joining us, but this will be recorded so that others can view it later. Quick reminder that the chat feature is not available. I did put something in chat. If you're seeking NNU credit from NNU, I have the second questionnaire in that, a link to that in the chat. Those of you who will be watching this later, the link to your assignment will be sent out in a follow-up email. And it looks like that email has been taking, sadly, about a week to hit your inboxes. So sorry about that, but gives you some time to do some research before you answer question number 3. I'd love to welcome our wonderful guest again, Mr. Patrick O'Connor. He is the one who's going to walk us through this important topic. And if you're like me, you have many parents asking you, or students actually too, asking you if they should test SAT or ACT because they're hearing such conflicting things from things that they're reading on social media or on the internet. So I've been looking, probably like you, have been looking forward to this particular webinar. So thank you, Patrick, for being here.
Oh, Ray Palmer, thanks for the invitation again, as always. Really enjoying the opportunity to do this and actually learn a few things myself as I do the research for all of this. So glad to see everybody here. Thanks to the folks who showed up. Palmer and Ray and I were kind of convinced we probably could have had this webinar at a booth at Wendy's. So it's nice to see such a strong turnout today on PSAT Day. Really appreciate everybody seeing you. So yeah, let's chat a little bit about today's topic, which is test optional schools. Give me just a second. We'll share screen here, and there we are. Yep. Okay, and there we go. Okay, good. Off we go. So let's chat a little bit about test optional. This is as Ray said, this is one of the things that is, a lot of things change from year to year, but this is certainly the thing that's getting a lot of attention, simply because parents are wondering if their child should even bother taking the test, which we're going to talk about a little bit. That's a different question than whether or not you send the scores, because if you don't have any scores, that's an easy question to answer. But let's take a look today at what exactly the world of test optional has given us, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. So we're going to talk a little bit of background on test optional colleges, just to give you some historic perspective on this. We'll then chat about test optional colleges and COVID, because that was one of the big factors behind it. But it is important to understand the role COVID played, because I think that's going to help you understand how to advise your students. Test optional colleges where we stand today, and then should the students bother to even take the test, which again, as I said, is a different question. And should they send their scores if they have them? So let's jump in and see where we are. Okay, as most of you know, we have had test optional colleges, or even what we call test blind colleges, for a very long time. The vast majority of community colleges do not require test scores, or technical colleges. Four-year colleges actually are on an interesting journey. For those of you who have who may remember, you may have taken, and if not, well, I certainly did. I remember at the time I was taking the tests, there were actually schools that only took the ACT. They required it, but they not only did they require a test, they only required one test. Everybody had to take the ACT, or everybody had to take the SAT. So, the environment I was raised in when I applied to college was such that testing was required, but it was a specific test. And interestingly enough, it was a geographic breakdown. If you were applying to a college in the Midwest, you had to take the ACT. If you were applying to a school on the remaining coasts, you had to take the SAT. And so as I first came into this profession, the big issue in testing was getting all the colleges to take either the SAT or the ACT, which finally happened. Actually, believe it or not, there were still some SAT only schools as late as the year 2000 or so. So we've come a long way, because now we're at a point where colleges aren't requiring testing at all. And that's a real radical departure in the last 30 years. So where did this test optional for four-year schools really begin? Well, it started with our friends up in Maine in Bates College. They went test optional in 1984, which was considered a pretty radical step at the time. And basically said, if you want to send them, great. If not, we're okay with that too. And then they proceeded, of course, to then do a 5-year study, a study every 5 years of the results of their admissions policy. Were they seeing a difference in terms of student performance based on whether or not they had submitted their scores? The most recent results we have is from 2009, which now is getting to be a little while ago. But keep in mind that represents 25 years of test optional policies at Bates. And what they discovered is that when they graduated, the students, first of all, they graduated at about the same rate. I think they said it was within 1% of each other. So basically the non-test submitters graduated at the same rate as the test submitters. Their GPAs were the same. And there's also an urban legend out there that says additional studies of Bates alumni showed that later in life there were no differences between mean salary, and there was no mean difference between life accomplishments. The only, again, this is all sort of out there. Can't really find the documentation. But the only difference that was there was with the happiness factor. And allegedly, according to the urban story, the students who didn't take the test were happier than the students who did later on in life. So we'll just leave that there for your consideration. The hard evidence, however, was clearly established with Bates, showing that the GPA and graduation rates were the same. And that proves to be pretty important to our friends at the university level. Okay. Excuse me. And so what are the implications of the Bates method? Well, I think the Bates method pointed out what all of us sort of know in our heart of hearts, which is not all students do their best work on a standardized test. It has been said that, it seems a little odd that a 3-hour exam would determine a student's qualification for university. And that sometimes is a little bit of an over exaggeration, because colleges that do require test scores require a lot of other things as well. So it's not like they only look at the test scores and admit based just on those. But nonetheless, because it is a part, or has been a part of colleges for such a long time, it's important to understand what its limitations might be. And it could be that you just had a bad day. And so On the other hand, it also could be a longer term issue where some students simply don't click with the language of the test itself. When I talk to my students about this, and they sometimes ask, well, which test should I take? I say, well, the difference between these two tests isn't all that great, but it's also sometimes kind of subtle. It's sort of like two English teachers teaching Moby Dick. They're both covering the same material, but the way that one teacher approaches it may make more sense to you than the way the other teacher does. Well, sometimes there are some students out there where neither the ACT or the SAT makes much sense to them and doesn't really speak their language in terms of how they look at the world. And that's what the Bates study has showed us. As a result, that means that within your applicant pool of your college, if you're not going test optional, you may be missing some very bright students who look at the world a little bit differently and would make a much richer part of your applicant pool, and actually make your campus all that more diverse in terms of the way they see the world. So Bates, in terms of taking the lead in this, really brought some key issues to the fore when it comes to the role of testing in college admissions. So what happens as a result of Bates doing this? Well, sorry, it takes a little bit of time, but the Bates method shows other colleges that they too should consider test optional. With Bates being a small liberal arts institution, it is no surprise that a vast majority of the schools that are going test optional are themselves small liberal arts colleges. But the key factor here is that this begins to get some folks thinking about the much bigger picture, which is, do tests really tell us anything? This was spurred in part because of the test optional movement that Bates started, but it also was the question that came up a little bit later on, once we started to see a large number of students participating in test prep classes. And these two things sort of combined to say, well, if you can actually teach somebody how to do better on the test without them really understanding the content of the test, does that really add anything to the predictive value of the SAT? There are studies by College Board and others that shows that the addition of test scores increases the reliability of the factors that show that students will finish college. But again, if the way that the student has earned a high score has been to study for the test rather than understand the content of the test, all of a sudden the value added of a test really comes into question. So when we combine what Bates has done with the test prep movement, a lot of colleges at this point, and this is maybe year 2005, 2010, we get a lot of colleges that are suddenly starting to think, well, given the stress that students have to deal with in terms of taking this test, is this test really telling us anything? And so that's where we suddenly start to see some movement there. And we begin to see the number of test optional schools really start to rise into the hundreds, ultimately breaking 1,000 at that point. Okay, well then of course along comes COVID, and COVID proves to be a real game changer when it comes to test optional colleges, for a very different reason. It's certainly, one thing to have a philosophical consideration about the impact of testing and what that does to students, but it's actually quite another when students can't take the test because it keeps getting canceled. And that's what we ran into in the early days of COVID, where test centers would simply not offer the test, period. and cancel them on very short notice. This was leaving a ton of students with no test scores whatsoever. And of course, it didn't take most colleges long to figure out that if they were going to stick to a requirement of ACT or SAT, and the students at that time couldn't even take the test, then all of a sudden your applicant pool goes down. Well, your applicant pools were already going down due to a low birth rate. And so when you combine this with the absence of test scores, it really should not come as a surprise that most colleges in 2020 said, yeah, if you don't have any test scores, don't worry about it. Just send it and we'll figure it out. Now, this has been a bit of a challenge for some schools because many schools relied pretty heavily on the test scores and their predictive value for admissions purposes. So if you are an institution that, for example, did not require teacher letters of recommendation or didn't require essays, you're largely looking at, excuse me, you're largely looking at admitting your class based almost exclusively on their GPA. And so this really led a lot of colleges to reconsider their admission policy and what received weight and what didn't, and ultimately led to some changes. I think there were many people who were hoping that review of their policies would lead to even greater changes besides test optional. As a rule, that hasn't really happened very much. Most colleges are responding to change based on what they have to do rather than what they should do. And so as a result, they really only took on the test optional component and made their best decision from there. Now, what's interesting is that in this rush at COVID, that COVID caused in terms of switching to test optional, we had a number of large public universities, and still do have a large number of large public universities that have gone to test optional. And these are the places that traditionally have been seen as relying on GPA and test score for admission. So it's interesting to see that even these large places that are dealing with a huge volume of applicants are actually switching their policies as well, and making them a little more user-friendly in terms of not requiring the testing. And many of those schools have remained the same. Of course, there have been some places that have taken an even bigger step once they've been spurred on by the Bates results, combined with the test prep movement, combined with the College Board material that suggests that low-income students and students of color and first-gen students really don't show their best work on the SAT or in most cases the ACT. This has led some colleges to actually become test blind, where you can't even send the scores. If you do, they're not going to look at them no matter what you do. And this of course includes the entire UC system, which was huge when the University of California and its 9 campuses said, yep, we're not going to look at scores at all. That was a pretty amazing step, because there's over 100,000 applicants to UCLA every year, and figuring out a way to measure the value of a student without a test score is a pretty noble challenge. If all you have is GPA, that can be a bit of a risk, but yet that's what the UC system did, because they felt that so many students were being disadvantaged by requiring the test. So COVID was a huge change agent in terms of testing requirements with colleges. And as a result, we also see some colleges that are what I refer to as test beneficial, which means if a student sends their scores and it helps them, they take them into consideration. But if they send their scores and it doesn't help them, they don't take them into consideration. That's actually the case with a good number of colleges, where they'll support, do everything they can to put the student in a positive light. Although there are some skeptics there who say, well, you know, if the student has actually submitted a score that's not very strong, how can you unsee that? How can you like not take that into consideration when you review the rest of their file? But in any case, there are a number of schools that will only be what we call test beneficial, which means if you send the scores, then they help you. Yes, they'll look at them, but if not, they'll ignore them and move on. Okay, so where are we today with test optional colleges? Well, certainly many institutions have realized that there is life without testing, and so they remain test optional. Many of them are continuing what they call their experimental period, where they will be running data similar to what Bates did in terms of students that how many students that were test optional and what were their grades like, how many students were not test optional and what are their grades like, what are their graduation rates like. And so many of the colleges that have adopted a test optional have not made it permanent, but have said they're continuing to use this information to build data to determine if they should become permanently test optional. Some institutions, however, have gone back to requiring tests. Now that COVID has largely no longer impacting students' ability to take the SAT or ACT, some colleges have felt that they missed it and that it was an integral part of their admissions program, and so they are now requiring it. Now, I should say that in most cases, these changes back to requiring the test have been done by a state's legislature or a state board of college education, where basically a state politician and policymaker has said, yep, no, COVID's over, we need to go back to the test. So in many cases, that decision was taken out of the hands of admissions officers by politicians who simply felt that the SAT and ACT develop a uniform standard that makes the process fairer. But again, that's the presumption of policymakers, not of actual admissions officers. It's also important to note that while many colleges are test optional for admission, some are still looking and requiring test scores for merit-based scholarships. That's a really important point. If you're dealing with kids who are looking for money, especially merit-based money, you're going to want to make sure that colleges they're applying to may need those scores for scholarship, even though they don't for test optional for admission. Some are program specific, and so there may be some schools out there where, say, for example, they're looking for test results for engineers, but not for liberal arts majors. Now, obviously, there can be some ways to work around that, where you apply as a liberal arts major and then transfer to engineering once you're there. But again, that's a pretty tough process to say uniformly exists for all colleges. And so you're going to want to make sure that you understand what each college's policy is about specific programs. It is of interest, however, to note that in terms of athletic eligibility, the NCAA has held with a test optional policy for the last couple of years. Again, it's, the NCAA is always changing their requirements. And so this is something to keep an eye on. But this was one of the last big institutions, if you will, that seemed very, very tied to test scores for eligibility purposes. And they have managed to figure out how to do it without those for the last few years. So it's going to be interesting to see where that goes as well. And again, the key, however, is to remember that these things have changed in the last several years. And it's quite likely that they will continue to change as we go forward from here. So lots of changes as a result of test optional. Okay, so now we finally get to the question that's brought us all here today, which is what advice should we be giving our students? Now, before I go forward, I just want to point out, I do my level best to include this photograph in every PowerPoint presentation I make. This fellow here, who is, I guess, the school counselor, this fellow here, when I first started giving PowerPoints in my career quite a while ago, and I Googled school counselor, this was the only picture that ever showed up. And so if this guy's making any money for every time I use his picture or anybody uses his picture, he's not a school counselor anymore. He's a millionaire but in any case, I always try and use that photograph. So what advice do we give to students? Well, as you build your list, as you do your review, as you consider what you should be doing, students should, of course, check the websites for current policies. Places like fairtest.org has a comprehensive list of schools that are test optional, and Fairtest does a great job to try and keep that list current. That said, and with all respect to Bob Schaefer and the crew at Fairtest, it will be important to make sure you actually check the college's website or its policies about admission and tests, scholarships and tests, and specific programs and tests. That's going to prove to be very important because, as I've said, this can change from year to year. It doesn't always change in a timely fashion. And so you want to make sure that your juniors are checking. And you want to make sure that they're checking once again in the fall of the senior year, just in case. It's also important for you as a counselor to keep in mind that this is a time where you may need to use those well-developed relationships with your college representatives, especially at the schools that many of your students apply to. One of the things that we've experienced, that many counselors have experienced, is that when they call the representative and say, so you guys are test optional, the college admissions rep will actually begin the conversation by saying, well, which goes on to mean, yes, we are technically test optional, but I have to tell you, we're going to give some advantage to folks who actually send the test scores in. We see that with the results of admission years. One of the things that has caused some counselors concern is the fact that when they look at some highly selective schools who claim to be test optional, it turns out that they admit 80% of their pool from students who submitted test scores and 20% who didn't. And in some cases, it's not even that good. In some cases, it's more like 90-10. And so when you're dealing with a statistic like that, let me urge you to proceed with caution. Here's why. One of the reasons why some students do not submit their test scores, or perhaps even why most of them don't, is because they aren't good test takers. Now, for many of those not good test takers, they are very, very good students. Again, they just don't speak the language that the SAT and the ACT are written in. And so their abilities and their gifts come in other areas or in a different way. And that shows through on the rest of their application, and that's not a problem. On the other hand, there are also some students who simply who do not submit their test scores and really don't have anything else in their application that makes them stand out. And while there are students who are high achievers with low test scores, a good number of students who do not have great test scores very often tend not to be very good students either. And so one of the things that we're seeing is that students who decide to take advantage of the test optional choice in some cases tend not to have anything else in their application that really makes them stand out. So we want to be careful not to confound that percentage by saying, well, if they'd have only submitted their test scores, they'd have gotten admitted. That may not be the case. And in fact, in most cases, it probably isn't. Because if they have pretty average grades, that could suggest they're going to have pretty average test scores. And again, not really have that become a point where they're standing out from their peers. So, when you look at those percentages, if they may be skewed, I can understand your concern, but at the same time, there's a little more to that story. So keep that in mind as you proceed. Okay, so then we get to the two key questions. Should students take the test? Well, I would say, and again, I'm a little old school on this, but I would say generally speaking, yes, they should. The reason why is because colleges can change their policies. But the other reason is it maximizes student options as they go into their selection and application process. I think we've all worked with students who have come and fallen in love with a school in the fall of their senior year, and if in this case, if they fall in love with that school and they require tests, and the student has not taken them, that could put the student behind in the application process. It certainly would put them behind in terms of applying early. And so you want to make sure that the student goes into senior year with all the tools they need to maximize their options. And for that reason, I still advocate for my students that they consider taking the test. As is the case, my advice has always been that the students take both the SAT and the ACT, largely because they are two different approaches to measuring what the students understand, and that they then take the one they're most comfortable with a second time. Now, again, that's obviously a little bit of time, a little bit of money. And so for students who are on a budget, they can certainly use the PSAT to get some idea as to how comfortable they would be taking the SAT and how well they do. And there are online ACT tests that would do the same thing. So again, my advice to most of my students in terms of whether they should take the test or not is yes, you should, in order to maximize your options for the fall. Okay, now that's a different question, of course, from should you send your score? And the answer here is, of course, as is everything in college admissions, it depends. What you want to do as a rule is you want to find out what your college's mean SAT and ACT are. Now, most colleges will be giving you a range of SAT and ACT scores representing the average middle, and that's fine. Again, take what the college gives you because those are the numbers that matter to that college. So if they give you the exact average, use that. If they give you the middle 50%, use that. But either way, take those numbers and then compare them to the student scores. If the student is scoring at or above that mean score that the college has given you, it's generally to the student's advantage to send the scores. The only possibility where you may still want to reconsider that is if a sub-score is particularly low. If there's a 300-point gap difference between the two sections of the SAT, or a 6 or 7 point difference on the ACT subscores, that may be cause to reconsider this. But as a rule, if the student has scored above the average of the institution, then at that point they should send the scores. If the scores are below, it's pretty likely that the student would not really benefit by having their scores submitted, and so at that point they probably should not do that. The only possible exceptions to those are first generation or underrepresented students. If you're working with a first gen or an underrepresented student who has an SAT or ACT score that's kind of close to the average, that it could be that among underrepresented students, that score is pretty high. And so in that case, that would be cause for them to be considered. So if that's the case, you may want to consider sending the scores. You may also want to send the scores if the students are of exceptional ability in some other part of the application, and simply say, well, look, we've all dealt with this when it comes to certain art schools, where we send the students transcript or test scores and they aren't necessarily all that great, but the student can draw a storm. With exceptional ability students, there may be a good reason to send the test scores. On the other hand, it could be that if the exceptional ability speaks for itself, then you don't really need to send the test scores at all. And again, as I said, keeping in mind that for some art students, particularly visual art students, there are some colleges that have a very different standard for those students that has little to do with academics. Basically, if they can draw, they're in. So make sure you understand that if you're dealing with a visual art student in particular that's exceptionally good, you may need to reconsider that as well. In terms of the future of test optional, as I said, we have a lot of colleges that are currently running statistical analysis of GPAs and completion rates and continuation rates to see if this change to no testing has really made a difference in the success of their applicants. Once all of that data comes out, I think many colleges will consider themselves to be clearer in terms of whether they should continue with test optional. It's interesting that of all the schools that have gone back to requiring tests, MIT is the only one who has done some kind of data analysis. That data analysis has been criticized by many as not being truly comprehensive, and that basically MIT is going back to test scores simply because somebody's telling them to. For me, my position on testing and institutional requirements for testing has always been, if you can show us a good reason to require the test, then it makes sense to require it. But if you're just doing it just because it's convenient, testing takes a lot of time and energy out of a student's day and out of a student's life. And most of the time they're much better off not taking the tests, because they can devote that energy to real learning and the actual pursuit of other interests, and developing themselves as a more complete person. So for me, I'm encouraged to see that many institutions are now using a data-based approach to deciding the role of testing. Again, I think that's long overdue, but I think the data will make it clearer for each college in terms of where they need to proceed and what they may need to do next. So that is a quick look at the wonderful world of testing. And I have talked for far too long, so I'm interested in addressing your questions at this point.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, we have a few questions here that have been asked. I think one question, some of them are real specific, and you may say you're not able to respond to them
Sure.
without more details, for that situation. Maybe a little broader one. One question here is, I think this is from someone who is kind of assuming that we should be downplaying testing in the schools.
Okay.
And asks, given the current landscape, what recommendations do you have to not only educate students and families, but how can we educate our district leadership? Many districts feel a pressure to do what the district next door is doing by offering the PSAT or offering a school day SAT, but then it's difficult to answer why we believe it's best not to do that, not to take school time for that.
Okay. Well, I think I think if I were asked to give my leadership a presentation, I think I would make sure that I would include the results of the Bates work from Bates College, indicating that in terms of college readiness, test scores don't really necessarily add all that much. Having said that, though, I think I would also say that that again, as a professional, my advice would be to continue to keep offering the tests, simply because it maximizes student opportunity. We've come a long way in a short amount of time with the number of places that are test optional. But there are still a number of schools that are not. And this is especially true if you're living or working in a state where all state universities are still requiring tests. To me, that's a no-brainer. You got to put the kids first. I may personally feel that test optional is a better way to go. But if that's going to hamper student choice or limit student choice, I think we have to continue to do that. What I think is important in this whole test optional movement is to get away from what the folks next door are doing and get back to actually what the test scores are telling your district about your curriculum and whether or not that actually is helping you or not. There are some folks from ACT and College Board who are able to talk with you about the implications of those test results as it relates to your curriculum. And if that has purpose, I think talking about that makes a lot of sense. So I think I would probably hang my hat on talking about Bates, talking about the test optional movement and what it has discovered so far, talking about the advantages of testing, but also talking about the advantages of testing as it relates to student choice, which for me at this point would indeed require that students take the test in order to keep those options open as much as possible.
What are your thoughts on students pursuing test prep to get their scores up to the average for the schools they're interested in?
Well, I mean, for me, I must admit I'm not a big fan of test prep simply because I think I worry that the wrong kind of test prep basically gives the student a score without any additional knowledge. That said, if a student has found a place that they love and they're willing to put the time and the energy into it, I think it's wise to pursue that, because if the school is using testing, obviously the higher the score, the better your chances of admission. The only cautionary tale I always put behind test prep is make sure you develop a strategy that, number one, works for you. A lot of my students claim that they do self-paced test prep, and they don't really, in which case they need the structure of a course. But second, I think it's also important to make sure that whatever test prep they pursue does not come at the cost of doing well in their grades. If all of a sudden, we have a student who through the first semester of the junior year is a 3.75, 3.9 student, but then has become so fascinated with doing test prep that those grades start to suffer, that's a way bigger problem. And so I would urge students to make sure that they achieve the right amount of balance and not to let their grades suffer at the expense of test prep.
Look at the big picture. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Yep.
Can you clarify the decision process for exceptional ability and arts students, and when should those students submit versus not submit scores?
Yeah, I can tell you that those are sort of institutionally specific answers. So I wish I could get, if I knew that one, I think, I'd be buying you guys all lunch. But each institution has long had its own special rules about exceptional ability students. First of all, if you have a student with an exceptional ability, you have to make sure the college knows that, and that's not something we take for granted. That may or may not be in the teacher letter, that may or may not be in the student essays, but I realize there are some schools that don't that don't require counselor letters, but if you've got a kid who has an exceptional gift, you need to let the college know about that. I have a friend who's lives in Illinois, and apparently they have some kind of statewide history constitutional contest among junior high and high school students in the state of Illinois. And his daughter won that contest starting as a 7th grader for 5 years in a row. Well, if an applications for that child went out of the college counseling office or the school counseling office without mentioning that, that's a big shame on you to that counselor. So first, make it known, and second, this is a time, even in this busy age, where these are questions you should direct and have a phone call if you can with your college representative from the college you're interested in. Because that's really where you're going to get the answer. As a rule, most public institutions, when it comes to art students, will still have some kind of academic requirement that the student has to meet that isn't all that different from the history major. On the other hand, most art schools will tend to give preference to the student's abilities over their GPA. And in fact, there are places like Cooper Union where I've had 4 different reps, and each one of them has said the same thing, which is if they can draw, they're in. So again, this varies greatly from institution to institution. And let me just make a quick pitch, if I may, for saying this is the kind of question you want to ask those admissions reps that are like Palmer, who are still visiting high schools. To me, one of the biggest sins and the biggest wastes of opportunity is when those folks come in and counselors don't spend 5 minutes with them not just saying thanks for coming, but for really asking them some key questions. Those would be 2 of those key questions, and is a real good opportunity to make sure you're developing a strong relationship with the person who's going to be shepherding those applications through the process.
I think that also may give you some nuance that might be missed in a web page or something like that. So
absolutely.
I have a feeling this question will be impossible for you, but let me go ahead and ask it. And that is, how do you determine which colleges you should send a test score to, even though they say they're test optional? That may be what you just answered, in fact.
Yeah. Well, again, to me, that's another question that I think is important. to ask of the representative if they're visiting, or with a quick phone call. I would also say, quite honestly, keep your ear to the ground, because high school counselors are not hesitant to share their opinions. We are a, if nothing else, we are a very supportive supported group of folks. And so, this is the kind of thing where you could call in another counselor and say, well, I'm sending this application here. What's been your experience with test optional? But I think, again, as I said earlier, you want to look closely at those numbers. A few years ago, there was an Ivy League that shall remain nameless, where they admitted 95% of their class from students who did test scores. Well, okay, I just told you why, those numbers don't tell you anything. That number tells you a lot. So, if you're looking at a place where we're talking 85, 90, 95% of the students were admitted with test scores, you're going to have to come up with a really good reason not to send them. Now, that reason could be that the test scores are terrible, and that's a really good reason. But if you're on the fence and you're looking at those kind of numbers, to me, that's kind of a done deal. But again, your best advice is to contact the college admissions officer for your school, and see if you can have a confidential conversation.
So that's pretty labor intensive. So here's a follow-up question. Where can you find the numbers for admitted students who submitted test scores versus didn't submit test scores?
Yeah.
Is there a central resource, or is that a school by school research?
Yep. Yeah, unfortunately, at least to the best of my knowledge, there is no place that offers that breakdown, and there are some institutions who do not offer that breakdown. And so, this may be like the crown jewels. It may be difficult to discover exactly where that information is, because it doesn't exist. So, my hat is off to the institutions that offer that and share it on their websites. But again, that is a few and far between. And to your point, Palmer, that is kind of an intensive thing. And so you may find yourself limiting that research only to a few places for students that are truly, truly deeply interested in that institution.
I think just let me make a comment and see if I'm reading you correctly, Patrick, too. As you're presenting this information, you're not putting this out here as being pro test optional or anti-test optional. You're just trying to paint a picture of the landscape for how to best help your students get through the admission process.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And actually, to be fair about this, I know there are a lot of people out there who get blood in their eyes when we talk about SAT and ACT, and I get it. Look, I once, when ACT, well, I'll give you a quick story. We got a minute here, don't we? I went to my annual college board update in my area, and the rep was really excited because college board was recentering the scores and all the rest of that stuff on the ACT or the SAT. And so at the break, I said, well, boy, that's wonderful, because now you can create a new SAT that's no longer culturally biased, and that's going to really advantage students of color. And she looked at me like I was the dumbest guy in the room. And she said, well, we can't do that. She was talking to me like I was 4. And I said, well, why not? And she said, well, because if we do that, then they can't compare the new SAT to the old one. So now hold on to your hats, kids. This meeting that I went to was in 1983. So we're basically looking at least a 40-year history of continued cultural bias in the SAT in the interest of continuity. So, I know there are lots of folks, unfortunately, who have been victims of that cultural bias, whose test scores really, ended up hurting them. And so I can understand why folks would want to say do away with it. on the other hand, I also had a representative from a large Big Ten school say to me once, well, Pat, when our students come to our institution, for the first 2 years, they're in classes with 300 students and the exams are all multiple choice. So if they aren't really able to express themselves through the format of multiple choice, chances are they're not going to succeed at my institution. And so that's why we require the test. Well, for me, that's not exactly, data rich, but it's not bad as a jumping off point for explaining why you do it. My real beef is if you're offering the scores, if you're requiring the scores and you don't know why, it's time to find out. That's basically my attitude about testing.
One last question. This is very specific. This person says, I have a 3.0 client applying early action to a number of colleges, mostly quote match unquote level publics, but a couple of private schools that might be quote reachier unquote for him. He has decided to take the October 22nd ACT. I don't have hugely high hopes his scores will make a difference in his admissibility. Question, because he will submit for November 1 deadlines and won't have scores, which box would you recommend he select? Consider my scores or don't consider my scores?
Wow. Well, okay. Always tough to give advice on a student I've never met. But, having said that, if he has to send it, I think what I would do is, honestly, if it's permissible, if it's possible, I would leave that box blank, and simply have the counselor indicate in their letter that the counselor is saying the student will contact you later once they know what their scores are. It really doesn't make sense to say consider or don't consider if you don't know what your scores are yet. So if there's a way to work that out, I would omit the box completely. If you're forced to actually make a choice, then I would say, consider my scores, but then again, have the counselor reach out to the college and say, look, he had to make a choice, so he did, but realistically, he's going to think about this, and I'm going to be in touch with you once we actually know what the scores are.
Thanks, Pat. Appreciate you bringing this to us. Ray, is there anything you want to say to wrap us up and get us ready for the next session?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just wanted to mention that next session is November 9th. Yep, November 9th, and another great topic, the FAFSA 101, which the FAFSA application, everybody knows, opened October 1st. So many of us are working on those right now with our students, but I think that's going to be another great topic. Thank you, Patrick.
You bet. Thanks, guys. Always great fun. Thank you again for the chance to chat about this.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And again, those of you watching this later, the information for NNU's questionnaire, what you have to do to get the credit after each webinar, will be sent through an email. And I think that email has been taking possibly a week to hit inboxes. So, yeah, but just please know it's coming. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.